Virtual streaming event with Janice Nimura. I'm Kathy, one of the Adult Services librarians here at the library, and before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At any time during the discussion, you're welcome to submit your questions to the author by typing them into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel, and we'll get to as many of your questions as time allows. If you're having technical issues with Zoom, this program is also being live streamed on Facebook, so you can access it there and put your questions in the chat. Also, if you're interested in purchasing Janice's book from our local independent bookstore, The Learned Owl, there's a link in the chat to do so. I'm very excited about our guest tonight. Janice Nimura is the author of the book, The Doctors Blackwell, How Two Pioneering Sisters Brought Medicine to Women and Women to Medicine. It is the story of Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, the first and third women respectively to earn medical degrees in the United States. Author Amanda Foreman said, "The Blackwell sisters took on the medical establishment and won. They are heroines, not just of their time, but for every age. Their incredible story has been crying out to be told, and in Janice Nimura, they have the ideal biographer." Janice is the winner of a 2017 Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the author of Daughters of the Samurai, A Journey from East to West and Back, a New York Times notable book. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Janice Nimura.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for joining me tonight. I'm just going to share my screen so we can look at some pictures. There. So, everybody comfortable? The Blackwell Sisters. So you may be familiar with the name Elizabeth Blackwell, if you're familiar with either of them, usually followed by the phrase first woman doctor. She was the first woman in America to receive a medical degree in 1849. And her sister Emily, on the right there, followed her to become the third woman to receive an American medical degree in 1854. And together they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children, and then the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary. So I had never heard of the Blackwells until 5 years ago. I couldn't believe that I had never heard of them. I had been born and raised in New York, in the city where they practiced. I had gone to a proudly feminist all-girls school from the age of 5. I was the math and science kid at that school. I graduated with the intention of studying medicine, although I drifted. And I'd never heard of them. How could that be? It began to seem to me that maybe this was a story that was ripe for retelling. So I started to look around a little bit and discovered that the Blackwell story tends to be easiest to find on the children's biography shelf, where it looks like this. Variations on this. This is a chapter book for girls from the 40s. Always a slim, elegant, well-dressed young woman with a stethoscope bending over solicitously bending over a grateful patient in a hospital bed. This is the middle grade version I found in my daughter's school library. Same nice clothes, elegant woman, stethoscope, grateful patient. Here's the picture book version, a younger, perkier version, but there's still the stethoscope right there waiting to be used. And these books always featured just Elizabeth and never her sister, Emily. But the Blackwells looked like this, and they were never photographed holding stethoscopes. And even if they had been in the 1840s and 50s, when they were the age of those slim young women in the picture books, stethoscopes would have looked like this. These were the ones that were still in use. So the picture book versions were incomplete. All of the complexity, all of the ragged edges, all of the contradictions were kind of scrubbed away, and all you got was this saintly, sweet, inspiring portrait. And it felt like there must be more. I wanted to know the whole story and not just what fits in a picture book. So I headed for the archives. What is that story? The Blackwell story is kind of a gift to biographers because there were 9 siblings and they were never really in the same place at the same time, so they never stopped writing to each other. So there were mountains of material for this project, which was both wonderful and daunting because a lot of that material looked like this. This is what you did in the early 19th century when paper and postage were both pretty expensive. You wrote all the way down the sheet, and then you turned it 90 degrees and you wrote all the way down the sheet again. Here's a close-up so you get a sense of what cross-writing looks like. It's a little dizzying. This was a daunting project. There was a lot to go through, but at the same time, all of these siblings writing to each other gave me this incredible depth of perspectives, writing to each other, writing about each other. It struck me that this was going to be a fun project because of all these perspectives I had access to. So what's the story here? The Blackwells, 8 out of the 9 of them, were born in Bristol, England, the children of a paradox, a dissenter from the Church of England who had made his fortune in the sugar industry, and who was an ardent abolitionist in his spare time. Think about that for a second. He was profiting from a commodity that depended on enslaved labor, even while he abhorred slavery. His dream was to find a way to make sugar using sugar beets that you could grow in the North without enslaved labor instead of sugar cane grown on Caribbean plantations. So on the strength of this dream, he moved his family from England to America via New York, and then all the way out to what was then the frontier town of Cincinnati, in search of a way to make sugar out of sugar beets. And then, having gotten them all the way to Cincinnati, barely having unpacked, he died broke, leaving a widow and 9 children on the edge of civilization, and teaching his 5 daughters very clearly that a husband is no guarantee of security. Happily, he also gave his 5 daughters the same education as his 4 sons, something unusual. So his 3 eldest children, all 3 girls, immediately hopped into action as teachers to kind of rescue the family from poverty. But none of his daughters ever married. So the 9 Blackwell siblings really became this tribe. Elizabeth was born, getting ahead of myself. Elizabeth was born in 1821. She was born 200 years and 1 week and 1 day ago. Her 200th birthday was last Wednesday, February 3rd. She was voraciously brilliant, socially quite awkward, and blessed with a healthy sense of her own worth. She admired the transcendentalist writer and editor, there she is, Margaret Fuller, who at this moment in the mid-1840s had just published a best-selling book called Woman in the 19th Century. And in this book, Margaret Fuller argued that humanity was not going to reach a new level of enlightenment until women unleashed their own power and proved that they could be whatever they wanted to be. It wasn't a matter of sex, it was a matter of talent and effort. Women could be sea captains, she said. And Elizabeth really saw herself even as a teenager, as someone whose life might be able to prove Margaret Fuller's point. She thought big. She thought maybe she could be one of those women who led humanity toward the light. And so she chose medicine, rather strategically, not because she was called to it. She thought sickness was a sign of weakness. She thought bodily functions were fairly disgusting. But medicine at this point was in flux, both scientifically and professionally, institutionally. Hitherto, it had been more of a trade, the trade of midwives and barber surgeons. Country doctors became country doctors by following other country doctors around and apprenticing themselves. But increasingly, medicine was becoming a profession of men who had a credential, a medical degree from a medical school. And increasingly, there were medical schools in America. So Elizabeth thought to herself, if I find my way to a medical school and attend all the lectures and pass all the examinations, who can argue that I am not as qualified as any of my male classmates to be a doctor? And medical school, as this cartoon from the 1820s suggests, was not the rigorous academic challenge that it is today. Today, you have to be a really talented student and scientist to make it through medical school. Back then, medical school consisted of 2 identical 16-week terms repeated 1 year after the next, purely lectures, If you were lucky, you got to see some dissection. If you were really lucky, you got to do some dissection. But mostly it was a matter of listening, taking notes, passing some examinations. People saw medicine as what you went into if you weren't smart enough for the law. So Elizabeth, being quite brilliant, had no doubt that she would be able to handle it if she could just get herself a spot in a medical school. So at the age of 26, she won herself admission to a tiny rural medical school in Geneva, New York, Geneva Medical College. That was the building on the left. It no longer stands. On the right is the spot where it once stood. And Geneva College has since evolved into Hobart and William Smith colleges in Geneva, New York. So how did she win herself that admission? She had been rejected and rejected and rejected from the prestigious medical schools of Philadelphia and New York. Nobody could imagine a woman medical student. The idea of a woman choosing to study the functions of the body in the company of men was outrageous. The idea of a woman dissecting and learning anatomy was outrageous. But she had been studying in Philadelphia with a rather prominent physician who had written her a letter of recommendation that the faculty of Geneva College received. And the faculty of Geneva College was not quite brave enough to say no out of hand to this Philadelphia surgeon. So they punted, and they tossed the question of whether Elizabeth Blackwell should come to Geneva College to the students, who were a fairly rowdy provincial bunch. And they said, okay, if any of you object to this woman joining us, then she won't come. And they thought they were safe because they figured certainly some of the students would be as appalled as they were. Well, the students saw this as an opportunity for some serious mischief. Their professors were too cowardly to say no. Well, then they were going to say yes. They figured it was probably a prank that had been cooked up by a rival medical school. And so they returned a unanimous yes to the faculty and then forgot all about it until 3 weeks later, when Elizabeth Blackwell walked into the lecture hall and began her studies in earnest. She quickly sort of warmed to the subject. The intellectual challenge appealed to her, and she quickly earned the respect of her fellow students, who realized that they were going to be left in the dust if they didn't run to keep up with this new and talented student. In between her 2 terms at Geneva College, Elizabeth returned to Philadelphia and found her way to Blockley Almshouse, which was then the largest municipal hospital in the country, sort of a warehouse for the destitute. This was a place of last resort, a very good place to observe illness, not a fabulous place to watch healing, because there wasn't much. But Elizabeth found herself in a room off the syphilis ward, the women's syphilis ward. And if you were in the hospital with tertiary syphilis in the 1840s, you were in very bad shape. And she began to make interesting connections between poverty and disease, between moral behavior and venereal disease. She started to observe epidemic disease because this was the summer of 1848, and waves of Irish refugees were arriving with typhus, also known as ship fever. She actually chose to write her thesis on ship fever. Interesting choice. She was not going to write about obstetrics or gynecological illnesses. She was going to write about something that was neutral as far as gender was concerned. So she wrote about typhus, and her thesis was published in the Buffalo Medical Journal once she had graduated in 1849 at the top of her class. Her thesis was published as the lead article, which was quite extraordinary. She was an extraordinary student. But like most medical students, she graduated with an alarming level of ignorance, having not spent much time with living patients and certainly not treated them herself. She had watched a lot, but not in Philadelphia, but nothing, she had not practiced yet. So what to do? Because most hospitals in America were not going to let a woman walk the wards and learn as a resident. So she went to Europe, which a lot of American medical students did, because the capitals of Europe, like Paris and London and Edinburgh, were excellent places to learn the best in the field. So she went to Paris, where she found her way to a public maternity hospital housed in this convent, which still stands. I took this picture, I went to visit. in Paris called La Maternité. It was a public hospital for training midwives. So young women would come from all over France and commit themselves to be students in this hospital, to live there in dormitories, learn how to be midwives, and then go back to all of the departments of France. And Elizabeth made the interesting choice to commit herself as a student to this place. Even though she already had an MD, she thought she would never be able to see the same volume of obstetric cases as she would in this hospital. So she made the decision to become a student there and live in the dormitories with the other students, and continued making connections, interesting practical connections between the ideas of poverty and disease, because if you were delivering a baby in a hospital in 1849, you were destitute. Any woman who had a choice would have delivered at home. So the women who were delivering babies in this hospital were wretched women. Many of them were prostitutes. Many of them were infected with venereal disease. And it was here that Elizabeth had a sort of a crisis that changed the shape of her career, even if not its direction. She was attending to the newborn of a woman infected with gonorrhea. Now, when a baby passes through the birth canal of a woman infected with gonorrhea, it can contract gonorrheal conjunctivitis, an eye infection. And Elizabeth was tending to one of these infected infants when some of the washing liquid splashed into her own face. And she ended up contracting gonorrheal conjunctivitis, which today, though not a joke, would be not a big deal, treated with antibiotics. Then it was a catastrophe. And she was instantly confined to bed in the hospital where she had been working, where she lay for weeks, not knowing whether she was going to retain her sight. It was very likely that she was going to lose, she was not going to emerge with her sight. This is one of those moments where here's a good object lesson in what it feels like to be the biographer trying to tell a story that happened 150 years ago, and trying to tease apart all the various accounts. So Elizabeth's own account, written in her memoir about a half a century later, went something like this. And well, first of all, she was under the care while she was lying ill in the bed at La Maternité of one of the attending physicians, the wonderfully named Hippolyte Blot, who had befriended her and she him, and they had been working together in the hospital. He became her caregiver when she was ill. And in her memoir, she wrote about the experience like this. Ah, how dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished and the eye was left in darkness. It almost sounds like a romance novel. We have another account of what was happening to Elizabeth during this crisis, because her eldest sister, Anna Blackwell, was also in Paris at the same time. Now, Anna, as the eldest Blackwell, was a Class A drama queen and a journalist. So she hastened to Elizabeth's bedside and helped to take care of her while writing furious long letters home to the Blackwell clan, reporting on what was happening to Elizabeth. And what she was reporting sounded more like this. The pupil presents just now the appearance of one of those little misshapen blackberries of 3 granulations and half dried up that one sees so often on some scrubby little bush. If you can fancy one such in dull-looking lead, you have just the appearance of this poor eye. So, as the storyteller in the present, you get to sort of braid all of these various accounts together and try to come closer to something that looks more like what really happened. The loss of her eye, eventually Elizabeth lost one eye and was fitted for a glass prosthetic. You can sort of see in this portrait that her gaze is asymmetrical, but most people who didn't know her history did not know that one of her eyes was glass, and she never spoke of it. But it did focus her more and more toward her natural inclination, which was the study of public health more than practicing on patients. Elizabeth Blackwell was not crazy about taking care of other humans, but she was really interested in raising humanity. So because she could no longer do surgery with one eye, and even reading could be difficult sometimes, she moved more and more toward the pursuit of public health. She did not run home to convalesce after this crisis. She continued on, went to London, where she studied at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and there she had a fateful encounter. Mutual friends introduced Elizabeth to Florence Nightingale, who in 1851 was not yet Florence Nightingale. She was a young woman from a wealthy family who desperately wanted her to settle down and get married, while Florence Nightingale desperately wanted to make her mark in the world of nursing and explore ideas that she was starting to have about hygiene and prevention and sanitation. And her encounter with Elizabeth Blackwell was rapturous, because here was this woman, this American, who had left her family behind, never wasted any time worrying about marriage, gotten a medical degree, and now was roving all over Europe studying medicine. Florence Nightingale was enthralled by Elizabeth Blackwell as proof that she might be able to pursue her own dreams. And they really hit it off and talked endlessly about their ideas about hygiene and public health, until they hit a sort of a fundamental divergence in the way they thought. Florence Nightingale believed that the role of women in health was as nurses, and Elizabeth believed that women needed to prove that they could be doctors. And so they always had this disagreement at the base of their relationship, which continued mostly for the rest of their lives. An interesting contrast. Elizabeth returned to New York after finishing this training in London, thinking she would hang out her shingle and take private patients who would be thrilled to consult a woman about their embarrassing, intimate illnesses. And then no one showed up. Why not? Well, in New York in the 1850s, the very phrase female physician didn't mean smart young lady with a medical degree. It meant someone like Madame Rastel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist, someone who operated on the wrong side of the law. This is a caricature from the National Police Gazette showing Madame Rastel as a baby-eating demon. This is what people thought of when they thought woman doctor. And if you were choosing to consult one, you were probably involved in some sort of scandal or doing something that was not approved by society. So no one came. And Elizabeth hit kind of a becalmed moment where she was struggling to make ends meet. So meanwhile, she had anointed her sister, Emily, 5 years younger, to follow her into medicine. Elizabeth knew that this was going to be a rough path to pursue alone. She was going to want company, and that company might as well be another Blackwell, because the Blackwells were the best kind of people. So she chose Emily, and Emily, who had some natural inclination towards science, said, okay, that sounds like a path I can take. She struggled even more mightily than Elizabeth had to find her way into medical school, because after Elizabeth graduated, all of the male medical schools closed their doors even more tightly against women, because Elizabeth had proved one could slip in. They didn't want that to happen again. And meanwhile, in Philadelphia and in Boston, women's medical colleges had begun to open. So men's medical colleges didn't need to accept women anymore. They could say, go over to the women's colleges. That's for you. We don't need you here. You don't need to be here. Emily, though, did not want what she saw as an inferior degree from a women's institution. She wanted the same level of degree that her sister had earned. So she found her way to Rush in Chicago, and where she had an excellent first year, impressed everyone. But then her mentor went on sabbatical, and the trustees decided that they really didn't want a woman around, so they asked her not to come back, right in the middle of her degree. Undaunted, she pivoted and found her way to Cleveland Medical College, which is present-day Case Western, and finished up there in 1854. And then she too needed some practical training, so she went to Edinburgh, another major capital of medical innovation, and where she attached herself as an assistant to James Young Simpson. James Young Simpson was one of the most prominent physicians in Britain at the time, physician to the Queen, a professor at the University of Edinburgh. He was the man who had discovered the anesthetic properties of chloroform. He had discovered this by passing a decanter of chloroform around at his dining table, whereupon all of his friends burst into hysterical laughter and passed out under the table. He was a bit of a showman. And it was clear from reading the accounts that Simpson kind of enjoyed the shock value of having a female assistant among his assistants. He kind of enjoyed the impact that had on people visiting him. At the same time, he taught Emily a great deal and had a lot of respect for her. He taught her to use some of the tools that he was using in an innovative way, things like pessaries, which were used intravaginally to help with uterine prolapse. He had designed an instrument called the uterine sound that was for measuring the cervix. He was a pioneer of the pelvic exam, which was sort of startling to Emily at first, but she soon came to really respect his diagnostic abilities. And she wrote all of this home in letters to Elizabeth, who was sitting without enough to do in New York. Here's a letter that Emily sent with drawings of those two instruments. On the left there, you can see the pessary, and underneath the sound with its measurements. I love finding letters like this and being able to go and find the things they describe and feel them and touch them. I knew all along that I wanted this book to be a story of two sisters and not just Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman doctor. But of course, there is more material about Elizabeth because she was first. She wrote more. More was written about her. And so what do you do as a biographer when the material is a little thin on one of your subjects? Well, one of the things you can do is my favorite thing to do, which is follow them around. Go where they went, look at what they're describing, feel how it feels to stand where they stood. So I went to Edinburgh and followed around Emily. Everything she described, I tried to go and see and feel and touch. This is 52 Queen Street, Simpson's residence, which still stands, and where she would have gone every day to help in his consulting rooms. It was the only house on the row with an extra story because his household was always just bursting at the seams with patients and friends and family. And the door was open on the day that I took this picture. So in the spirit of following in the footsteps, I walked in. It's a drug rehabilitation center, so I wasn't really trespassing on private property. But I wandered around a lot inside a little bit until somebody asked me to wander out again. And you see details and you think about Emily's daily life in this building. For instance, James Young Simpson's initials worked into the uprights of the banister, which is still part of the house. Thinking about Emily walking up those stairs to the consulting room every day, and also thinking about what kind of a man would have his initials worked into his own staircase. All illuminating details. I also went to the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. They wouldn't let me take photographs, but I could take notes. And there were all kinds of Simpsonian artifacts, things like his pill box there in the middle on the left, his portable pill case that said, "Please return to 52 Queen Street" under the lid when he made house calls. Down on the lower left, there were two of his stethoscopes, his monaural stethoscopes in ivory and rosewood. And I wanted to believe that maybe Emily had used one of those when she was working with him. They even had the decanter from the chloroform. So that was fun. Emily was learning a great deal and was very skilled. She was in most ways a better doctor as a practitioner than Elizabeth was. But she still came in for the same degree of suspicion and ridicule. This is a cartoon from the London satirical newspaper Punch from the end of Emily's time in Europe. It shows what is supposed to be Emily on the right, wearing the scandalous bloomer costume of the women's rights activists, with a ridiculous hat and a rather mannish profile, peering through spectacles at the only creature that would consult her as a patient, a lapdog, being clutched in the arms of a much more conventionally lovely and feminine woman. This is the kind of snark that they drew. So Emily finished up in Europe and came finally to join Elizabeth in New York, where in 1857 they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children in a building on the corner of Bleecker and Crosby Streets in Greenwich Village that still stands. There it is as it was on the left and as it is now on the right. It was the first hospital staffed by women. Their intention was not just to give poor women a place and an opportunity in which to consult women doctors about their intimate ailments, but also to create a place for the slowly growing numbers of female medical graduates to get the practical training that you didn't get in medical school. I was privileged to meet the woman who owns this building and who has taken it as a mission to restore it. She is a jewelry designer, and her studio is in the building, and she has been renovating the building from the inside out. And I actually got to write some of the chapter about the infirmary in the infirmary, which was a great thrill. Here you can see her. You can see some of the original hearths, the original brickwork, what the windows would have looked like. Those were the original windows. It was just a thrilling thing for me to feel like I was that close to the ghosts. So as you might expect, the Blackwells played a role in the Civil War, which came up right after they had founded their infirmary. In 1861, just after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the Blackwell Sisters called a meeting at their infirmary of their donors and supporters, wealthier women and some of their husbands who, what do we do now? How do we support this urgent cause? And they drafted this appeal that appeared in the New York Times to the women of New York, and especially to those already engaged in preparing against the time of wounds and sickness in the Army. They invited interested women to join them at Cooper Union, a big building downtown, to try and figure out how to channel all of this energy. And in response to this appeal, thousands of women gathered at Cooper Union to form an organization that was called the Women's Central Association of Relief. That organization soon morphed into what became the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the biggest civilian organization of the war. So you can draw a straight line from the Blackwells' drawing room to the U.S. Sanitary Commission. The Blackwells found themselves as the leaders of the committee that was charged with finding, vetting, and training women to become nurses to send to the front. They threw themselves into the work, but were soon feeling a little frustrated because it became really clear that New York's male physicians were not interested in working alongside female physicians as colleagues. For instance, their infirmary was excluded from the list of hospitals that would be training the nurses to send to the front. Meanwhile, in Washington, the leading leadership role had been given to Dorothea Dix, a woman without medical training who the Blackwells called the meddler-in-chief. No love lost there. They were frustrated at what they saw as a failure to recognize what their skills, how their skills uniquely qualified them to be leaders. And eventually, after a year of effort, they withdrew their war efforts and turned to their next and biggest accomplishment, which was kind of ironic. They had always scorned women's medical colleges as turning out an inferior kind of graduate. But the graduates of the women's medical colleges that were coming to train with them at their infirmary were really subpar. And so what to do, since this was all a woman could find as far as medical education went, the Blackwells finally changed their minds and opened a women's medical college of their own in 1869. Vowing that it would be more rigorous than the programs they themselves had attended, which it was. It was 3 years instead of 2. It wasn't a repeated series of courses. It was courses that built on each other. And there was a lot of practical instruction at the bedside at their infirmary. So that was the Women's Medical College. So that was the arc of their professional achievements. Personally, their lives were just as interesting. Both Elizabeth and Emily adopted daughters, even though neither married. Emily lived with a female partner and fellow surgeon, Elizabeth Cushier, for the last 3 decades of her life. 2 of their brothers, Henry and Sam, married 2 of the most prominent feminists of the day, Lucy Stone, a suffrage activist, and Antoinette Brown, who was the first woman in this country to be ordained as a minister. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Emily didn't really see eye to eye with their sisters-in-law as activists. They were significantly out of step with the women's movement of the day. Elizabeth, in particular, didn't really believe that the top priority for women should be the vote. She really thought it didn't make sense to give the vote to women who were just going to use it as their husbands and fathers told them to. that wasn't it more important for women to win their independence ideologically before having something like a vote. She liked to say that she was too progressive for the conservatives, but too conservative for the progressives. And Elizabeth and Emily didn't agree with each other a lot of the time about the role of women in medicine. Elizabeth, as I said, was moving more and more toward public health. And Emily was a very competent surgeon, obstetrician, medical professor. She believed that the role of a woman in medicine was to be as good a doctor as any man, and not to just be a teacher armed with science. And so after they founded the Women's Medical College together in 1869, immediately afterward, Elizabeth left. She went back to England, where she had always wanted to live permanently, and spent the last 40 years of her life there pursuing public health, moral reform. She helped found the National Health Society with its motto, "Prevention is better than cure." Meanwhile, Emily stayed in New York and ran the institutions that they had both founded extremely competently for the next 40 years, really in a way sustaining her sister's legacy almost to the detriment of her own, since very few people have heard of Emily today, which was what I wanted to remedy. So that's the outline of the story. And this moment, as we celebrate the inauguration of our first female vice president and all sorts of new cabinet roles for women, I think it's a particularly good one for this story with all of its contradictions and complexities. And I want to close with this photo, which for me sums up the work we have to do. When you Google Elizabeth Blackwell, you get this photo every time. It shows up on websites, in articles about her. It graces the cover of at least one biography of her. It's a lovely photo of an intelligent-looking young woman, sort of gazing into the future, very nicely dressed and coiffed. It's not Elizabeth Blackwell. How do I know that? Well, if you flip the photo over and you see the advertisement for the studio where it was taken, you see that it was taken at Dana's Photo Portrait Gallery on 14th Street and 6th Avenue in New York. Now, that photo studio existed at that location in the 1880s. And in the 1880s, Elizabeth Blackwell was in her 60s. This is probably her niece. And you can see the provenance on the back of the photo. Somebody has written Bessie Blackwell across the top, which might have been the niece's nickname. Somebody trying to be helpful wrote, "Oh, Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman doctor of modern times." Okay. And so the Museum of the City of New York cataloged this as possibly Elizabeth Blackwell. Down below, somebody else has written, probably not, since Dana is at 14th Street address circa 1885. So right there on the photo itself is the proof that this is not Elizabeth Blackwell. Yet it's sort of how people want her to look. We want our heroines to look and feel a certain way. We want them to be perky and elegant and strong, but not abrasive. We prefer them to be adorable. And the Blackwell sisters were not interested in pleasing anyone. They were not perky and pretty. They were complicated, prickly, imperfect, sometimes self-contradictory, very real heroines, and they changed the world. And I think this is a great moment for us to meditate on that for a moment and try to apply that lesson to modern times and understand that you can be an extraordinary trailblazer without always being admirable. Thank you so much for listening, and I would love to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Janice. That was very interesting talk. And I do see a question here. Actually, there's a comment that I do want to share with you. Eileen says, Simpson forceps are still occasionally being used today during childbirth. Now I know who Simpson was. Thank you.
Excellent.
And then we have a question from Christine. She says, what was your favorite story you discovered while researching that didn't make it into the book?
Oh, gosh. It didn't make it into the book. Gosh, I have to give that a little bit of thought. I guess maybe some of it would have been, well, can I pass on that one and come back to it? I have to give that a little bit of thought. let's move on, and then it'll come to me, because I know there's so many that I just can't pull one out of my head right at the moment.
That's not a problem at all. I can certainly ask you some other questions. I know that there's you mentioned in the book that she met President Lincoln. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I'm always amused by the fact that she didn't mention in her memoir that she met President Lincoln, which I found very telling. So during the Civil War, after she had finished working for the Women's Central Association of Relief, at one point she took a trip down to Washington, almost as a sightseer, to sort of see the epicenter of the war effort for herself. And she had a friend who was working in the Capitol, and he was giving her a tour of the public rooms of the White House, and met a friend who said, "Oh, President Lincoln is free right now. Why don't you go up and see if you can say hello?" And so they do that. And Elizabeth is very underwhelmed. She's sort of like, the guy is kind of gangly and ugly, and I'm surprised that this is the brilliant force that I've been reading about. But they have a conversation, and then they part ways, and she never really refers to it again, which I find so interesting, because this is a woman who really had an extraordinary degree of confidence, and also an extraordinary degree of discomfort with other people. And I think somebody who was maybe more of a self-promoter and who was better at PR might have taken that opportunity to talk to the president about the cause of women's medical education. But she was much more interested in just kind of getting a good look herself up close and privately, a sort of a privileged look, and then going home. It was sort of a telling moment.
That's really interesting. Here's another question. Beth wants to know, is there any evidence that they fought for a leadership role during the Civil War before leaving the organizations?
Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell were of that early kind of feminist who believed that you made change by being quietly excellent. And if you were just quietly excellent enough, the world would come to meet you. They really didn't like people who made noisy fusses. And so when they were passed over for these leadership roles, they complained to each other and to certain intimate correspondents, but they didn't make noise about it because it wasn't their style. And I see this over and over again with certain kinds of early pioneering women, this attitude that our role is to be undeniably excellent so that no one can deny us what we want, as opposed to later generations who were marching or demonstrating or hunger striking, or some of the more kind of aggressive sensational tactics. That was really not their style. So when things didn't go their way, they just sort of pivoted to a different goal instead of arguing about it.
Interesting. So Carolyn wants to know, did the sisters share the same abolitionist views as their father?
Yes, very much so. They were raised on it by him, and then they took it further themselves. This was something they were very passionate about as young people. Interestingly, and I think like a lot of activists today also, the kind of abolitionist activism that they did, going to conventions, writing about it, raising money for it, reading the work of William Lloyd Garrison and all of that, they were much better at that on the sort of ideological plane than when they were confronted with the reality of the wretchedness of slavery, because at different moments, both sisters held teaching positions in slave territory, and lived among slave owners and enslaved people. And their level of discomfort, when they're sort of excited about it because they're sort of feeling like, okay, now we can put our abolitionist ideas into practice and do some good down there. And then they get down there and they're kind of overwhelmed by their own discomfort, both with the white slave owners and with the enslaved people that are around them. And it's very human and telling to watch their discomfort. They try to, do some good, and then eventually they are relieved to move on because it's overwhelming. And I found that, horrifying and sad, but also very human, that reaction. It's easy to talk about it when you don't live within it.
I think that's true for sure. Becky wants to know, did she ever meet Clara Barton?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
That's as much as I know. Sorry, I can't go there.
Okay. Laura says, I'm a proud Case Western University mom. For how many years did Emily live in Cleveland, and do you know where she lived exactly as a student there, or can you tell us a little more about her time there?
Yeah, so she just spent one 16-week term there. It was very brief. She was there to get her degree and get out. I don't know where she lived. I know that she enjoyed taking, no, that was in Chicago, sorry. Her time in Cleveland was so brief, and she was there with a very singular purpose. So I know, there's information about her relationships with some of the professors at Cleveland Medical College, but other than that, she was there to get her diploma and move along. Sorry.
So another question is, how long was the school in existence? How many women graduated from their medical school? And can you tell us a little bit about the finances of the school, how it was financed, and, did they have difficulties with that?
Right. So their infirmary and their women's medical college were both financed by donors, by people who believed in their cause and supported them. Many Quakers, freethinkers. Once they were established, the state also, gave them the usual subsidies for those kinds of institutions. Interestingly, as I mentioned, they founded this college kind of under duress. They never intended to found a women's college, and they saw it as a temporary measure. We are going to do this until the world catches up to us and women are given the spaces in men's medical colleges that they deserve. And that's exactly what they did. Emily did. Elizabeth had left the scene at this point, and Emily ran the women's medical college at a very high level until 1899, when institutions like Cornell and Johns Hopkins finally decided to start admitting women. And as soon as they did that, she announced that she was shutting down the college because its purpose had been fulfilled. She did not run it for its own sake or for her own self-aggrandizement. She really just saw it as a way of holding the door open for women until the men recognized that the women belonged among them. And then she shut it down. The infirmary persisted for another century. And it eventually was absorbed into what is now part of Weill Cornell and New York Presbyterian Hospital. It's still Lower Manhattan Hospital.
There's an anonymous attendee who wants to know if the sisters had any later contact with Florence Nightingale.
Yes, they corresponded throughout their lives, and I think there was always some envy on the part of Elizabeth, especially, who had who wanted to be recognized, right? She wanted to be a beacon to other women, and she was always a little bit envious of Florence Nightingale's global fame, something that Elizabeth Blackwell never achieved. I'm always interested in the fact that they founded the New York Infirmary on May 12th, 1857. May 12th is Florence Nightingale's birthday. And I think that wasn't an accident. I think they figured, let's see if we can, take a little bit of her shine and use it, and make sure that her name is mentioned in the context of our project. I just remembered the story I wanted to tell that didn't make it into the book.
Go for it.
I hope that person is still here. There was a lot I was fascinated with some of the issues around abortion and around abortionists who were in the mid-19th century, both Madame Restell, who was very successful, and others who were much shadier. And there was some amazing newspaper coverage, sort of tabloid newspaper coverage of, like the butcher of Second Avenue, who would invite women to have abortions, and then when they died on the table, he would like cut them up and put them into trunks and try to ship them off on trains. There was some really graphic true crime stuff that had no place in this book, but that was kind of the most gruesome and fascinating rabbit holes to go down about the real sort of wretchedness of some aspects of medicine.
Wow.
So there's an answer for you. Maybe you're the question now.
That's a good answer. And it brings up the question for me of how long did it take you to write this book? And I mean, I know you said that, a lot of your research was focused on the letters that went back and forth between the siblings, but how much time did you spend on other research, and how long did it take you to actually write the book?
The book took about 4 years. And there was archival research. There are huge dumps of Blackwell papers, both at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe in Cambridge, Boston, and at the Library of Congress in Washington. So those were the two biggest places to look. And then there were smaller collections in many different places. And then there was the walking in the footsteps part. So going to Edinburgh, going to London, going to Bristol, going to Paris, going to Geneva, New York, and wandering around in the infirmary building in Greenwich Village here in New York, and walking around to all the addresses that Blackwell spent time at. That happens to be the only building that's still around, but that to me was the fun part.
It sounds like fun. You got to do a little bit of world travel, and
never a bad reason to go to Paris.
Yeah, darn, I have to go to Paris. So Eileen wants to know, she says, it's very interesting to me that they both adopted daughters. Can you tell us anything about how they were able to juggle their work and motherhood?
Depends how you define motherhood. The differences in the way they adopted daughters was very telling as well. Elizabeth, in the mid 1850s, this is while Emily was training in Europe, and Elizabeth was in New York, struggling really to find enough food. She was lonely, and she was starting to slide into depression. And so, because she was the kind of woman who believed in remaking the world the way it should be, she went to the orphanages on Randall's Island, which is here in the East River, and plucked out a 6 or 7 year old little Irish girl named Kitty Barry and took her home as sort of a combination servant daughter. She was her ward, but she was also her companion. And Kitty grew up to be very well, I don't know if she was well suited to the role, but she embraced the role that Elizabeth chose her for, which was sort of to be her acolyte, to be her companion, never to marry, never to pursue her own career, but to sort of be part daughter, part servant, and part fan, and give Elizabeth some of the love that she found it hard to find with other humans. Emily adopted a baby after Elizabeth moved back to London, and named her after her mother, and the child called her Mama, and signed her letters with kisses, and eventually grew up and got married and gave her 4 grandchildren. So it was a more mainstream relationship, not quite as the relationship between Kitty and Dr. Elizabeth, as she always called her, was a little alarming at times, I think, to the outside eye. Although Kitty seemed very just profoundly grateful to this woman who had rescued her. And when Kitty died at a very advanced age, asked that her ashes be interred in Elizabeth's grave. So, it was interesting. As far as how they juggled their careers and their daughters, I don't think they did. The girls were raised by, the people who were around them. There were servants, there were nurses in the hospital. They weren't really juggling at all.
Interesting. You mentioned, John asks, you mentioned their father a few times. What was their relationship with their mother?
Good question. Hannah, the matriarch, she was not the educational influence in the family. That really was coming from the father. The children's intellectual capacities were coming from him. Hannah's role seems to have been to have worried inordinately about the state of their souls. Whenever I came across a letter from Hannah, it was always endlessly worrying about whether the child she was writing to at the time was going to church or not. There was a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of kind of non-comprehension of especially what her daughters were off to professionally. 2 doctors, 1 journalist, 1 artist. This was way beyond her understanding. She was, she was the mother of 9 and had been the mother of more than 9 because not all babies made it then. She was very different than her daughters, and she sort of was the spirit of the hearth for them. They always returned to her, but I think she irritated them deeply.
Mike wants to know, since their father was in debt when he died, how was their education and travel to Europe funded?
Right. Well, the 3 eldest children, who were all daughters, immediately founded a school in their living room upon his death and started to earn money as teachers. They all continued to earn money as teachers to keep the family afloat until the brothers, who were sort of more in the middle of the pack, grew up enough to get jobs and start supporting the family themselves. And then between their own earnings and their brothers' support, that was what helped them find their way to tuition and passages to Europe. Once they came back to New York, it was really from donations that they funded the hospital and the college.
And I think we have time for maybe one more question. MH wants to know, did Elizabeth remain in England and is buried there? How long did Emily live, and where is she buried?
Okay. Elizabeth is buried in Kilmun, Scotland, a place where she vacationed while she was living in England, and it captivated her, so she asked to be buried there. She has no connection otherwise to Scotland. She lived in Hastings for her old age from about 1880 through 1910, but she's buried in Scotland. Emily is buried in Chilmark, Massachusetts, on Martha's Vineyard. The Blackwells had a sort of a family compound, summer retreat on Martha's Vineyard from the 1860s on, and she enjoyed visiting there. And so she's buried in Chilmark. Her partner, Elizabeth Cushier, is buried in Greenwood Cemetery here in Brooklyn. They weren't buried together, which I find kind of poignant.
Yeah, that's interesting because they were together for, what did you say, 30, 40 years?
Yeah, they were partners.
Yeah, wow. All right. Well, I think that actually finished up all of our questions that patrons have asked. And so, Janice, I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's a fascinating talk. It's a fascinating book. I encourage everybody to get a copy and read it. And thank you all for joining us as well. And have a great night.
Thank you so much for your good questions.